Greetings, my knights. Military historian John Keegan once observed that the First World War was a turning point. For the first time on a major European battlefield, guns and projectiles killed more soldiers than hunger, infection, and disease. For most of previous history, it was the opposite. The deadliest enemy in war wasn't the man in front of you with a sword. It was the filthy camp behind you, the contaminated water in your cup, and the invisible things crawling in your stomach. So today, let's go back to the Middle Ages and ask a very simple, very uncomfortable question. If you were a medieval soldier, what were the real odds you'd actually die in battle? Picture it. Weeks of marching in the same damp clothes, thousands of men and animals packed into a valley, latrines dug too close to the stream, meat hanging in the sun, lice, flies, and rats everywhere. Before the enemy even shows up, men are already dropping from dysentery, fevers, and starvation, their bodies quietly carried to mass graves while the banners are still being painted. In this video, we're going to put the sword aside for a moment and look at the real boss fight of medieval warfare: disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Using work from military historians and medical historians, we'll see why camp epidemics routinely killed more troops than combat, how commanders tried, and usually failed, to control them, and why the modern image of war as bullets and explosions would have looked almost alien to a 14th century soldier. If you enjoy this kind of deep dive into the brutal reality behind medieval warfare, make sure to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Then let's find out why so many medieval soldiers really were dead men walking long before the battle began. When historians dig into the sources for medieval and early modern wars, one pattern jumps out immediately. Battle is not where most soldiers die. For campaign after campaign, the majority of deaths come from disease, malnutrition, and exposure, rather than from swords, arrows, or lances. That sounds counterintuitive if you grew up on films and games where war is all about the clash of armies. But in the numbers and in the medical evidence, the real killer is almost always the camp. There are a few reasons for this. First, a soldier only spends a tiny fraction of a campaign actually fighting. Marches, sieges, and waiting around in camp take up far more time than the handful of days when lines meet on the battlefield. If a campaign lasts months, that is months of drinking questionable water, eating food that is often undercooked or already spoiling, sleeping in crowded tents and breathing in the coughs of hundreds of other men. Every one of those factors is a gift to infectious disease. Studies of medieval latrines, for example, routinely find eggs of intestinal parasites such as roundworms, whipworms, and tapeworms, confirming that chronic parasitic infection was common. These parasites weakened soldiers, made them more vulnerable to other infections, and turned diarrhea into a normal part of life. Second, the way medieval armies were organized almost guaranteed poor hygiene. Camps were dense knots of men, animals, cooking fires, and rubbish, often thrown together in a hurry on whatever patch of ground was available. Latrines were frequently dug too close to tents or streams, either because commanders did not understand contamination or because the army simply did not have time and space to do better. Rain could wash human waste back into the water supply. Flies could carry pathogens from latrines to food. Medical and military historians describe this as a classic example of fecal oral transmission. Microscopic traces of excrement get into food and drink, seeding the camp with dysentery and other gastrointestinal infections. When you combine that with dehydration from marching and the stress of campaign life, a bout of diarrhea that would be merely unpleasant today can become deadly. Third, armies often operated at the edge of starvation. Supply systems were primitive by modern standards. Food had to be carried on wagons or seized from the surrounding countryside. Grain could spoil in wet weather. Salted meat might already be half rotten when it reached the men, and fresh fruit or vegetables were rare on campaign. Malnutrition weakens the immune system, making soldiers more likely to catch whatever is going around and less able to recover when they do. In many campaigns, we know that armies shrank dramatically before battle. Chroniclers report men falling ill in large numbers, deserting to seek food, or simply disappearing from the lists as they succumb to sickness along the road. Modern scholarship pulls these threads together. An influential article literally describes disease in medieval armies as the invisible enemy, pointing out that commanders feared epidemics in camp as much as enemy steel, and with good reason. Work on camp epidemics and pre-modern military health shows similar patterns across Europe. Outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid-like fevers, respiratory infections, and in some cases, plague sweeping through crowded forces and killing far more efficiently than battle. Even when major battles did occur, they were often the climax of campaigns in which both sides had already lost large percentages of their troops to illness. So in this first part of the video, the key idea is simple but uncomfortable. If you were an ordinary medieval soldier, your greatest statistical enemy was not the opposing knight charging you with a lance. It was the contaminated water barrel, the overflowing latrine trench, and the slow gnawing of hunger and fatigue. Understanding that basic fact completely changes how we see medieval warfare, and it sets up everything else in this episode. If the camp was the invisible enemy, then the march was the slow torture that fed it. Medieval armies did not glide across the map like pieces in a strategy game. They walked, often for weeks, on bad roads, in worn-out shoes, carrying equipment on their backs or on exhausted pack animals. Military manuals from the later Middle Ages already warned commanders that marching too far in extreme heat or forcing troops to tramp through frost and snow without proper wood and clothing would make them sick before they ever met the enemy. Bad water is a kind of poison, one text bluntly says, noting that a general has no remedy when he has to fight with disease as well as with an enemy. On the march, everything that was unhealthy about camp life became worse. Soldiers drank from ditches, ponds, and streams because there was nothing else. If the route crossed swampy ground, the risk of fever and dysentery soared. Food was another constant problem. Supply trains moved slowly and broke down easily. In many campaigns, the men lived off hard bread, salted meat, and whatever could be taken from local villages or fields. Grain could go moldy after a few days of rain. Salted meat turned rancid, and there was little chance to boil water properly when the army had to keep moving. All of this meant that digestive illnesses and general weakness spread through the ranks long before arrows flew. Climate and season made things worse. In summer, heavy armor and thick padding trapped heat and sweat, increasing dehydration and heat-related sickness on long marches. In winter, inadequate boots, soaked cloaks, and thin tents exposed soldiers to cold wind and snow. Hypothermia, frostbite, and respiratory infections followed, especially when men already lacked calories and rest. Chroniclers from many periods describe campaigns where the weather did more damage than enemy steel, with entire columns slowed to a crawl by mud or snow while sick and starving men fell behind to die. The combination of these factors meant that an army could lose a frightening share of its strength just getting to the battlefield. Modern studies of pre-modern warfare talk about march attrition, the steady bleed of men to desertion, sickness, and exhaustion that shrank forces by the time any decisive engagement took place. Even when commanders were aware of the danger and tried to plan shorter stages, avoid swampy ground or camp on healthier sites, they were limited by geography, enemy movements, and the basic logistics of feeding thousands of mouths. For an ordinary medieval foot soldier, marching was not just the boring part between battles. It was a long, grinding gamble with hunger, weather, and infection, a gamble many of his comrades lost before a single banner came into view on the horizon. If marches slowly bled armies, sieges were where disease and hunger went into overdrive. A siege is, by definition, about trapping people and cutting them off from supplies. That applies both to the garrison inside and to the besieging army outside. The attackers dig in around the walls, building camps and earthworks. The defenders cram into a fortified space with whatever food and water they managed to stockpile in advance. From a medical point of view, you could hardly design a better laboratory for epidemics. Inside the walls, the logic is brutal. Once the surrounding countryside is sealed off, no fresh food can enter, and waste disposal becomes harder and harder. Wells may be contaminated, cisterns run low, and overcrowding drives people into cellars, towers, and narrow streets where air barely circulates. Historical studies of pre-industrial cities show that war, famine, and plague often go together. Malnutrition weakens immune systems, and then infections spread faster in cramped, stressed populations. Chroniclers routinely describe garrison towns during long sieges, where people end up eating horses, dogs, leather, and worse before disease and hunger force a surrender. Outside the walls, the besieging army faces a different but equally dangerous set of problems. They are usually camped in improvised fortifications for weeks or months, exposed to the weather, drinking from local rivers or ponds, and trying to feed thousands of men and animals from a countryside already stripped bare. Overcrowding, inadequate latrines, and polluted water again create textbook conditions for outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid-like fevers, and other intestinal infections. One famous late medieval example at the Siege of Granada reports roughly 3,000 soldiers killed by enemy action, but many times that number dying from epidemic typhus, a louse-borne disease that thrives in crowded, unhygienic camps. Warfare also helped spread bigger pandemics. Research on pre-industrial Europe shows that peaks of warfare and peaks of plague outbreaks often overlap. The movement of armies and refugees, forced marches, and the packing of people into fortified towns and camps all accelerated the spread of Yersinia pestis and other pathogens. The notorious Siege of Kaffa in 1346, where plague-stricken Mongol besiegers experienced massive mortality and dead bodies were reportedly hurled into the city, illustrates how conflict could become a vector for pandemic disease, even if the precise details of that episode are still debated. For commanders, this created a grim calculus. A direct assault on strong walls was costly in blood. Waiting for hunger and disease to break the enemy was often smarter militarily. But every extra week spent in the trenches increased the risk that their own army would be crippled by the same invisible enemies. Medieval siege warfare manuals and later analyses both stress that sieges were frequently decided not by spectacular stormings of the walls, but by which side could endure starvation and epidemic longer. For the ordinary soldier, that meant a siege was less a heroic test of courage at the breach and more a long, anxious lottery. Will the walls fall, or will my body fail first? To see just how different medieval warfare was, it helps to jump forward to the age that John Keegan was talking about. For most of history, including the Middle Ages, infectious diseases like dysentery, enteric fevers, cholera, typhus, plague, and measles killed more soldiers than enemy weapons. That pattern continues well into the 19th century. In conflicts such as the Crimean War or the American Civil War, academic studies show that disease deaths often outnumbered combat deaths by 2 to 1 or more. In other words, the medieval problem of camps and marches being deadlier than battle remained very much alive. What begins to change in the late 19th and early 20th centuries is not that war becomes less deadly overall, but that medicine and public health finally start catching up with infection. Military medical historians talk about a shift from the disease era to the trauma era. As vaccination, germ theory, better sanitation, and organized medical services spread, infectious diseases become less lethal in armies, and direct combat injuries loom larger as causes of death. By the time of the First World War, many of the classic camp killers, typhoid, cholera, smallpox, are partially controlled on major fronts by vaccination, water treatment, and more systematic field hygiene, even though other infections and the 1918 influenza still take a huge toll. On the Western Front, for example, modern analyses of British and some Allied forces show that the majority of military deaths came from shells, bullets, and gas, rather than from disease, a reversal of the pre-modern pattern. One detailed study of early war British cohorts found that about 94% of those who died in service did so from injuries, and only around 6% from disease. That doesn't mean infection stopped mattering. Millions worldwide died from wartime epidemics and the Spanish flu. But among soldiers in industrialized armies, disease was increasingly a nuisance cause of death and disability compared to artillery barrages and machine gun fire. This is the world Keegan had in mind when he highlighted the First World War as a turning point, a conflict where, at least on some fronts and in some armies, more men are killed by the direct violence of battle than by the microbes in their water. For a medieval soldier, that would have been almost unimaginable. In his reality, the greatest danger was not the one spectacular day when shields clashed. It was the weeks or months of filth, hunger, and exposure leading up to it. Remembering that difference helps keep our picture of the Middle Ages honest. If you want to understand what it really meant to go to war back then, you have to start not with the charge, but with the latrine. If you put all of this together, the life of a medieval soldier looks very different from the heroic paintings. Most recruits were not professional killers. They were farmers, artisans, or minor retainers who suddenly found themselves marching for weeks in bad boots, sleeping in wet clothes, eating hard bread and questionable meat, and sharing water sources with thousands of other humans and animals. Before they ever saw an enemy banner, many were already weakened by chronic parasites, bouts of diarrhea, coughs that never quite went away, and the simple calories they never quite had enough of. That is why chroniclers so often mention armies melting away on campaign. Men slipped off home because they were sick or starving. Others died quietly in ditches or makeshift infirmaries, buried without glory somewhere on the road between two towns whose names no one remembers. Even in famous campaigns that ended in spectacular battles, like some of the great clashes of the 100 Years' War or the Crusades, modern historians estimate that disease and hunger killed more soldiers overall than the fighting itself. For every knight cut down in a charge, there were many anonymous foot soldiers who never reached the field. So when we imagine a medieval soldier saying we're going to die before the battle, that is not just dark humor, it is a statistically sensible fear. The most dangerous opponents he faced were not always French knights, Mongol horsemen or Saracen archers, but contaminated water, spoiled food, lice, rats and cold nights in a leaking tent. Understanding that does not make the battles less dramatic. It makes the whole experience of medieval war more human and more tragic. These were people who signed up, or were dragged in expecting glory or at least pay, and instead found themselves fighting an invisible war inside their own bodies. If this changes the way you picture medieval warfare, that's exactly the point. Next time you see a painting or a movie showing two perfect lines charging at each other across a clean field, remember the weeks of filth and sickness that those images leave out. And if you want to keep exploring the messy, uncomfortable reality behind the myths of the Middle Ages, don't forget to subscribe to Medieval Crazy History and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because somewhere out there, a lot of medieval soldiers would tell you they never even made it to the battle scene. So in the end, John Keegan's point about the First World War being a turning point makes even more sense when you look back at the Middle Ages. For medieval soldiers, the decisive force of war was not high-explosive shells or machine guns, but the constant pressure of infection, hunger, and exhaustion that stalked them from the first day of the campaign to the last. Long before modern medicine began to push disease off center stage, armies were already fighting two wars at once, one against visible enemies in armor, and another against invisible enemies in their water, their food, and their own bodies. If this episode gave you a different perspective on what it truly meant to go to war in the Middle Ages, not just flags and charges, but also latrines, fleas, and fever, consider supporting this channel by becoming a member by clicking the link in the first pinned comment. Thanks for watching.